The morning arrived the way certain mornings do in eastern Kentucky in September, not with warmth, but with the suggestion of it, a pale gray light pressing through warped window glass, turning the room into something that existed between night and day, between one life and whatever came after. Caleb Holt stood in the parlor of his father's farmhouse outside Harlan and listened to his brothers divide the world without him. The room smelled of old pine and the particular tobacco his eldest brother Edmund had been smoking for 20 years, a cheap cut that left a yellow film on curtains and a permanent bitterness at the back of your throat. Rain tapped at the windows in a rhythm that had no pattern and no mercy. Through the glass, blurred and streaked, Caleb could see the east pasture, 160 acres of bottomland, stretching toward Clover Fork soil so dark and deep it looked almost black in the wet morning light. Soil that had fed the Holt family through 3 generations of droughts and floods, and one war that had taken Caleb's grandfather at Horseshoe Bend and given him back smaller and quieter than he'd left. Edmund stood at the head of the parlor table, which was really just the kitchen table carried in for occasions like funerals and legal matters, and this was both. He was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, the way their father had been with hands that looked built for work they rarely did anymore. He was 39 years old and had been running this farm in practice, if not in name, since their father Silas Holt's mine had started its slow retreat 3 years before. Now Silas was in the churchyard 2 miles down the road, and Edmund ran it in name as well, and the hand that had held the survey map was moving across it with the particular confidence of a man who had already decided everything before walking into the room. Roy sat across from Edmund, the middle brother, 35 and narrower in every dimension, narrower shoulders, narrower jaw, narrower range of expression. His wife Vera stood behind his chair with her arms folded across her chest. She had been whispering into Roy's ear for the better part of 3 weeks, ever since the night after the burial, when the 3 brothers had sat around the same table and Caleb had watched Vera's eyes move to the survey map on the wall with the precise focus of a hawk that has spotted something small and still in a field. Whatever she had been whispering had hardened into this morning. The family lawyer, a thin man named Creech, who kept his office above the feed store on the courthouse square, sat at the table's end with a stack of documents he hadn't opened yet. He adjusted his spectacles every few minutes in a way that suggested he could not quite bring what he was witnessing into acceptable focus, moral or optical. Caleb stood near the door. He had not been invited to sit. This was not an accident. Edmund traced the boundary line across the survey map with a thick finger, dragging it through the hand-inked contours as though the land itself were something that needed to be physically moved. The bottom land splits clean between Roy and me. The house and barn go with the east parcel. The west gets the mill rights and the timber stand along the creek. Roy nodded once, the gesture of a man confirming something he had rehearsed. Vera's expression did not change. Creech lifted his pen toward the documents, then set it down again. His eyes moved briefly to Caleb. And Ezra Creech began and then stopped because he had used the wrong name. The name from the documents, the legal name Silas Holt had given his youngest son at birth, for reasons he had never explained, a name Caleb had gone by only in church and courtrooms, and not always then. Edmund exhaled through his nose. Caleb gets the mountain parcel. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Even Vera uncrossed her arms. Creech set his spectacles on the table and rubbed the bridge of his nose as though the gesture might help. Everyone in Harlan County knew what the Black Ridge parcel was. 40 acres on the north slope of a ridge so steep that the surveyor who had mapped it 30 years ago had drawn the contour lines so close together they nearly touched, as though even on paper the land was embarrassed by its own grade. The soil where it existed was a thin crust of decomposed rock over sandstone and shale that broke through to the surface every few yards like bones through skin. The timber was old growth, but too far from any road to haul. There was no documented water source, no cleared land, no structures. Silas Holt had won the parcel in a card game in 1831 and had never once ridden up to look at it. That land won't keep a goat alive. Roy said it without looking up, the way a man states something so obvious as it barely warrants the breath. Vera's thin lips pulled into an expression that was not quite a smile, but was nothing else either. Caleb said nothing. He was 31 years old and had learned early that silence in this family was not absence. It was a kind of answer that cost nothing and lost nothing. He looked at the survey map at the pale cross-hatching the surveyor had used for the Black Ridge parcel, the cartographic equivalent of a shrug. He looked at Edmund, who was not looking back. He looked at Vera, who was. Then he looked at Creech, who was examining his own hands. He would take it. Edmund blinked. It was the first genuine surprise he'd shown all morning. "You're not going to argue." Caleb's answer was quiet and exact. Would it change anything? It was not a question. Edmund opened his mouth and closed it again, which was answer enough. Caleb folded the deed into the inside pocket of his coat, felt its stiff corners press against his ribs, and walked out into the rain. He spent 3 days packing and did not hurry. He had never owned much. The Hope Farm's abundance had always belonged to Edmund in practice, and now it belonged to him in law. But what Caleb owned, he had chosen with the same care he brought to everything he did, slowly and without announcement. The chest of tools his father had left him on his 18th birthday, a gesture that had confused him at the time, because Silas Holt had never been a man who explained his gifts. A canvas rucksack, a cast-iron skillet blackened to the consistency of riverstone from 8 years of use, 2 wool blankets worn thin at the edges but still good at the core, a 20-pound sack of cornmeal, a leather pouch of salt, a wooden crate of books that included a volume on natural philosophy, Liebig's agricultural treatise, and a copy of Lyell's Principles of Geology, with a spine held together by a wrap of brown twine, because he had read it so many times the original binding had given up. The books were the thing Edmund had not understood about him, and Roy had not bothered to try. To them, a book was a luxury or a pretension, something for men who had already secured their acres and their livestock and their mill rights, and could afford to sit indoors and read about other men's ideas. To Caleb, a book was a conversation with someone who had noticed something he hadn't noticed yet. He had read every volume in the Harlan County Lending Library twice, some of them 3 times, and had spent years in the marginal notes of borrowed books, leaving his own observations in a hand so small the librarian had once asked him if he'd been using a pen. He built furniture that outlasted the people who sat in it. He could read a hillside the way a riverman reads current. None of this translated into the language his brothers understood, which was the language of acres and bushels and liens, and the particular currency of other people's respect. He also took the mule. Bishop was a gray animal of indeterminate age and absolute conviction, a creature who had decided sometime in the middle of his life that he would cooperate with human intentions when they aligned with his own and resist them, otherwise with a stubbornness that bordered on philosophical. He had a habit of kicking the barn door at 3 in the morning for reasons no one had ever identified, and he had bitten Roy on the shoulder during the spring planting of 1849, hard enough to leave a mark. Roy still showed people at the Saturday horse auction. Edmund agreed to part with Bishop immediately and without negotiation. The night before he left, Caleb did not sleep in his room. His room was still his room. No one had told him otherwise, but the house had a different weight now, the way a garment feels different after it's been worn by someone else for a long time. He took his blanket to the hayloft and lay in the straw, listening to the horses breathing in their stalls below him and the September crickets working through their nightly inventory in the pasture beyond. He lay awake for a long time and felt something he did not have an immediate word for. Not grief exactly, not anger. Something more like the sensation of setting down a load you'd been carrying so long, you'd stopped noticing its weight, and the absence was tender in a way the presence never had been. Before dawn broke on September 18th over the Clover Fork Valley, he loaded Bishop and started north. The trail from the valley floor to Black Ridge was not so much a trail as a suggestion of one, a line through the forest that previous hunters and the occasional timber scout had worn into the hillside over decades without ever committing to it. It disappeared entirely after 3 miles at the point where the slope steepened past the threshold of casual ambition, leaving nothing but laurel thicket and moss-covered sandstone shelves dropping away at angles that made Bishop plant his hooves and consider his options. Caleb spent most of the afternoon with the hand axe cutting through the laurel stand in increments of 10 and 15 feet, the brush whipping back at his face and arms, his boots slipping on wet leaves over slick stone. Twice he had to unload Bishop completely and carry the packs himself around deadfalls that blocked the way, massive chestnut oaks down across the slope. There were root systems torn from the thin soil by some past winter storm, the root balls still standing 6 feet tall, like monuments to their own falling. The work was the kind that hollows you out by midday, and rebuild you by evening, and assuming evening is still available. By late afternoon, the slope leveled briefly and partially into a saddle between two rocky knobs, where chestnut oaks grew old and wide, their canopies interlocked overhead, in a ceiling that filtered the gray September light into a kind of permanent soft dusk. The forest floor here was deep in leaf litter, undisturbed enough that the impressions of deer hooves were still sharp from the morning's passage. He could see scat from turkey black bear, and something smaller he identified as raccoon. The silence was not empty. It was full of the particular sound of a forest minding its own business, which is the sound of everything at once and nothing in particular. He tied Bishop to a poplar and walked the property boundary as best he could reconstruct it from the deed description, counting his paces, noting what he found. The land was brutal in its geography, sloped too steep for plowing anywhere except a narrow ledge on the south face that might yield a quarter-acre kitchen garden in a generous year. The soil where it existed was poor, thin, and stony, more gravel than earth, the kind that exhausts itself in one season if you ask it to produce. The timber was good old growth oak and hickory and chestnut in diameter and straightness that would command real money at any sawmill, but the distance from any road capable of supporting a loaded timber wagon made that wealth as theoretical as the deed's acreage. You could own timber all your life and never convert it to anything. He was near the top of his parcel where the ridge flattened into a shelf of exposed sandstone when he found the opening. It was not dramatic. That was the first thing. It was not the kind of discovery that arrives with any fanfare. A gap in the rock face 4 feet wide and perhaps 3 feet tall, half hidden behind a fall of wild grapevine and Virginia creeper that had grown down over the entrance with the patient thoroughness of years. In the general dimness of a late September afternoon on a north-facing slope, it looked like a crack in a rock wall. Caleb might have passed it without stopping, if not for what his hand felt when he reached into the gap to push the creeper aside. Warmth, not the residual warmth of sun-heated stone. The sky had been overcast all day, and the sandstone face was cool and damp. This was something moving, a current of air flowing steadily outward from the gap, carrying a temperature distinctly above the ambient air of the hillside. He held his hand in the current and felt it the way you feel the heat from a stove across a room, gentle but unmistakable, like the breath of a sleeping animal. He knew what this meant. He had read about it in Lyell, the thermal constancy of deep earth, the way cave systems maintained temperatures that reflected the mean annual surface temperature of their region, neither rising in summer nor dropping in winter, holding their equilibrium through all the chaos above. He had read about it and filed the information away, in the way he filed most things, as one more tile in a mosaic whose final shape he couldn't yet see. Reading about it and feeling it on the back of your hand at dusk on a cold hillside in September were entirely different experiences. He got down on his knees and pushed the creeper aside and peered into the dark. Nothing visible. But the warmth continued to flow, and beneath the mineral smell of wet rock, there was something else, a depth smell. He had no name for the smell of stone that had been stone for longer than anything alive could remember. He pulled out his tin of lucifer matches, struck one, and held it into the gap. The passage narrowed immediately, dropping to perhaps 2 feet of clearance, the ceiling pressing down and the walls pinching in. He would have to go on his belly. He struck a second match and looked at the floor of the passage, packed sediment, dry, no standing water. He looked at Bishop, who was watching him from his poplar, with the expression of a creature who has seen his human do inexplicable things before and has decided not to get involved. He went in on his stomach, pushing with his boots, pulling with his hands, his shoulders scraping on both walls of the passage at once. The rock was cold against his coat. The warmth increased as he moved deeper, flowing over his face in the direction he was going, and for 10 feet the passage stayed tight enough that he was breathing from a space perhaps 18 inches above the floor, his cheek pressed against stone that tasted of minerals and time. Then the ceiling lifted. He felt it before he saw it, the change in air pressure. The way sound suddenly had room to exist, and he pushed himself to his hands and knees, and then stood upright in the darkness and stood still for a moment, just breathing. He struck a match. The chamber was large enough that the match's light didn't reach the far wall. The ceiling arched overhead in the shape of a vault. Not the flat ceiling irregularity of a natural rock shelter, but a true arch carved by water over millennia, into a form that suggested intention, though it had none. The walls were gray limestone, streaked with bands of rust and cream, and the floor was packed clay, dry and firm, unmarked, except by the geological settling of years. In the flickering matchlight, the scalloped marks of ancient water flow were visible. On the lower walls, shallow circular gouges, where the stone had been eaten away in the same slow rotation that carves river stones into smooth coins. The water was gone, had been gone for a long time. The temperature in here was extraordinary. Outside, September had already loaded its first cold rounds. The nights had been dropping below 50, and the climb had left him soaked through his wool coat in a way that was already beginning to chill. In here, it felt like a room with a stove going. Not hot, nothing like the wet heat of midsummer. More like the steady, inhabited warmth of a kitchen on a Sunday morning when bread is rising and someone is already awake. He unbuttoned his coat and stood with it open and felt the warmth settle around him as though it were a physical thing, not a temperature, but a presence. He struck a second match and walked deeper. The chamber extended back into the ridge for what his pacing suggested was 60 feet before the ceiling dropped toward a low passage he could not follow without committing fully to the crawl. Along both walls, he found shallow alcoves in the limestone, some smooth, as though they'd been sanded by water action, others bristling with small calcite formations that caught and scattered the matchlight in a fine-grained sparkling he recognized from Lyell's descriptions of speleothem deposits. On the ceiling, near the back of the main chamber, he found what he had not expected: soot. Old soot, dark and hard, embedded in the grain of the limestone rather than sitting on its surface. Someone had built fires in here. Perhaps Cherokee, perhaps peoples older than that whose names had not survived the distance. He pressed a fingernail into the carbon layer and felt no give. It had been there long enough to become part of the rock. The air moved constantly. That was the thing he kept returning to as he worked his way around the chamber, a gentle, steady draft, barely enough to feel on skin that was already warm, but consistent, flowing from the deep rear passage forward, through the main chamber and out toward the entrance. Not a weather draft, not the inconstant breath of a poorly sealed structure responding to outside pressure. Something driven by physics deeper than wind, by the differential between the cave's steady internal temperature and whatever was happening in the rock above, a continuous slow exhale of the mountain's interior warmth into the cooler air of the hillside outside. He stood in the darkness after his last match guttered out and listened to that movement passing over him, and in the silence that was not silence at all, that was the low, patient frequency of stone and mineral water and deep time. Something in him settled that had not been settled in a long while. He could not have told you exactly what it was. It was not happiness, or at least not the kind of happiness that arrives with circumstances. It was the particular feeling of having asked the right question and felt the answer before you could name it. He knew what he was going to do. The first weeks on Black Ridge were a kind of sustained reckoning with the difference between understanding a problem and solving it. He built a lean-to shelter at the cave entrance in 3 days using chestnut poles for the frame and thick slabs of bark stripped from a downed tree for the roof. Not beautiful, not permanent, but waterproof enough for the purpose and stable enough to hold the weight of a wet October night. He stored his tools and provisions inside it and began the work of making the cave livable. The entrance needed to be squared. The natural opening was irregular enough to be inefficient, heat bleeding out around the edges, rain driving in at an angle during storms, the passage tight enough that bringing in any load required taking it apart first. Caleb spent 4 days with his hand chisel, cutting the sandstone into vertical planes, working along natural fracture lines where he could find them, forcing them where he couldn't. The sandstone was cooperative in the way of stone that has been thinking about breaking for a long time. It came away in slabs and chunks that he stacked to the sides for later use. By the end of the 4th day, the entrance was 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, plumb and level, and he had a rough pile of dressed stone to work with. The cave floor was the larger project. The clay subfloor was workable. He could cut it with a spade and tamp it level with a flat rock, but the stones embedded in it were a different matter. Some were rubble loose fragments he could carry out by the armload and pile outside the entrance. Others were boulders that had fallen from the ceiling at some geological remove and settled into the clay floor so deeply that they would have to be split before they could be moved. He drove his iron wedges into natural cracks in the stone and swung his hammer until the shocks traveled up through his wrists into his shoulders, and when a rock finally split along the line of force, It made a crack like a rifle shot that the cave amplified and threw back at him from every wall. His hands blistered in the first week. By the second week, they had calloused over into something harder, a new layer of skin that had decided to be more useful than its predecessor. His back ached each morning with the specific grief of muscles asked to do more than they had previously agreed to. He cataloged the pain the way he cataloged everything, noted it understood its cause, and continued. The cave repaid the labor. Even in the third week of October, when frost had settled over the ridge at night and the oak leaves had turned to copper and begun their slow spiral down the interior, temperature held. He had fashioned a crude thermometer from a glass tube and a measure of colored spirits of wine, calibrated against the freezing point of water, and he took readings twice daily, morning and evening, recording them in his notebook with the date and the outside conditions. The cave interior in mid-October, 55 degrees. The outside air pre-dawn on the coldest night, so far 31 degrees. The differential was not just comfortable, it was remarkable. 24 degrees of warmth sustained by nothing but stone and depth and the slow thermal memory of the earth. He built a door frame of squared oak timber, the joints draw-knifed to fit tight, and hung a plank door on leather hinges, not elegant, but it kept the drafts from disrupting the cave's air circulation, which he had begun to understand was more complex and more important than he'd initially recognized. The draft flowed from the deep passages toward the entrance in a pattern that was steady enough to be relied upon, but gentle enough not to dry out the air. He built a sleeping platform along the east wall, raised 18 inches off the floor on split log supports, and discovered on the first night he used it that the air at ceiling height was measurably warmer than the air at floor level. The physics of thermal stratification that he had read about in the context of mine ventilation, but had not expected to find so clearly present in a cave this size. Wrapped in both his wool blankets on that platform, the cave's 60-degree air settling around him like something spun rather than blown, he was warmer than he had ever been in the farmhouse below, where two fireplaces burning through the night still let the cold in through every gap between the planks. October passed, he hunted. The ridge was not the wasteland his brothers believed. White-tailed deer moved through the chestnut oak stands in the hours before dawn, and after dusk, drawn by the mass that had fallen thick that year, in a carpet of burrs and inner husks across the leaf litter. Wild turkeys scratched through the debris in groups of 6 and 8, unhurried and loud enough to track from a quarter mile. Squirrels were in their autumn abundance, filling their caches, and forgetting half of them, chattering at him from every oak as though he were a minor inconvenience they had decided to narrate. He shot a buck in the third week of October, a mature animal with a rack wide enough to be impractical in the laurel, and hung the carcass from an oak limb in the cold air to set. The venison would last him weeks. He processed the carcass, methodically separating cuts, trimming, fat salting what he intended to keep. He had done this work his entire life on the farm below, and did it now with the automatic efficiency of long practice, his hands moving through the familiar sequence while his mind worked on a problem he had not fully articulated yet. That night, lying on his sleeping platform with the door latched against a wind that had picked up from the northwest, he turned the problem over until it became a solution. The cave's steady temperature, the constant moving air, the natural draft flowing from deep in the rock toward the entrance, steady and gentle, like the breathing of something vast and patient. He had read in a treatise on food preservation he had borrowed from the county library 3 years before and never quite returned, that the ideal conditions for slow-curing meat were a combination that was nearly impossible to achieve in a conventional above-ground smokehouse. Consistent low temperature, measured humidity, and steady airflow that moved smoke evenly across every surface of every piece. Conventional smokehouses were boxes of variable weather. They ran hot on clear days and cold on overcast ones. Their drafts were inconsistent. The smoke pooled on one side and left the other untouched. The temperature swings cooked the meat as much as cured it, drying the exterior while leaving the interior undertreated, producing results that varied from batch to batch in ways that experienced smokehouse operators managed through constant attendance rather than through any reproducible control. This cave had all three conditions in their ideal form naturally and continuously without any effort on his part. If he could introduce smoke at the back of the cave, build a small fire in the deep alcove near the rear passage, where the natural draft originated, the moving air would carry it forward through the entire length of the chamber, and out the entrance flowing over whatever he hung from the ceiling in its path. The smoke would travel at cave temperature, not the 120-degree blast of a conventional firebox. Something closer to 70, maybe 80 degrees warm enough to penetrate, cool enough to cure slowly the way slow curing was supposed to work, the way it almost never did in practice, because the weather never cooperated. He lay in the dark and worked through the variables one by one, and when he could not find an objection that held, he allowed himself the specific satisfaction of a man who has asked the right question long enough to arrive at the right answer, not triumph, but recognition. The next morning he tested it. He split a quarter of the hanging venison into strips an inch thick and 2 inches wide. Not jerky thin, not roast thick, but a middle dimension he estimated would show him the cure's progress quickly enough to be useful. He drove wooden pegs into ceiling cracks near the front of the main chamber, close to the entrance, where the draft would have been moving over the meat for the full length of its travel. Then he carried his axe into the chestnut oak stand behind the cave and cut a supply of green hickory, not dry seasoned wood, which burns clean and hot, but fresh cut wood with its moisture still in the grain, which smolders rather than flames and produces a cool, thick, blue-white smoke, loaded with the compounds that give cured meat both its flavor and its preservation. He built the fire in the deepest alcove he could reach, without crawling a shallow hollow in the rear wall of the chamber, where the stone had been carved by some ancient water action into a natural depression. He kept it small, a fire the size of 2 fists pressed together, feeding it green hickory chips that caught slowly and smoldered rather than flamed. Within 3 minutes, the smoke was moving. He could see it in the matchlight, thin at first, and then thickening into a blue-gray current that traveled at the pace of a slow walk toward the hanging strips at the front of the chamber. It rose slightly as it moved the thermal buoyancy, giving it a gentle upward drift, and it reached the meat in an even curtain before curling past the doorframe and dissipating outside. He watched it for a long bunch. Then he sat down on a flat stone and kept watching. There was nothing to do now but wait. The fire needed tending every few hours, feeding with fresh green chips, clearing the ash that accumulated and choked the draft. He did this through the day and slept that night with the fire banked low, waking twice to add fuel each time, noting the smoke's behavior and the temperature at the hanging meat with the small thermometer he held up to a candle flame to read the meniscus. The reading held steady between 70 and 75 degrees, a range so consistent across 12 hours of variable outside conditions that he recorded it twice in his notebook to make sure he was not making an error. 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, he climbed down from his sleeping platform and cut a strip from the lowest hanging piece with his pocket knife and stood in the cave's warm dimness and ate it slowly. The venison was a revelation, and he sat down on a stone ledge because his legs decided that was appropriate. It was not like smoked venison. It was not like any smoked meat he had ever eaten, and he had eaten smoked meat his entire life, raised on a farm that processed its own hogs and deer and had a conventional smokehouse behind the barn that his mother had supervised with a practiced hand for 20 years. What she produced was good, solid workmanlike, preserved and edible, and sometimes even distinguished on a cold winter morning with cornbread. But it was the product of a process fighting against its own conditions, a constant negotiation between the fire's tendency to run hot and the weather's tendency to be uncooperative. This was something different. The texture was firm but not resistant, not the chewy toughness of over-dried meat, but something with structure, and give the fibers of the venison still cohesive but tender, as though the process had persuaded the proteins rather than forced them. The color was deep translucent amber at the edges where the smoke had concentrated shading to a dark red-brown at the center that caught the weak candlelight like stained glass. The flavor was layered in a way that was difficult to describe to someone who hadn't tasted it. Hickory at the surface clear and warm, but beneath that something mineral and complex, a faint quality he could only attribute to the limestone walls and the ancient air, and whatever chemistry occurred when smoke spent 4 days moving slowly through a stone chamber that had been sealed from the weather for millions of years. He ate the strip and then sat for a while in the warm silence. He hung the rest of the buck. He began experimenting. Wild turkey came next. He shot a pair of mature birds in early November and processed them with the same approach, hung whole smoke moving over them for 5 days at the same temperature range. The result was a golden-skinned bird with a flavor that deepened the longer you chewed it, the hickory smoke integrated into the meat, rather than sitting on its surface the way a good sauce becomes part of a dish rather than a coating on it. He tried squirrel, which was delicate and slightly sweet and probably unnecessary but interesting. He tried rabbit, which turned out too lean to hold the cure properly, emerging dry and flat in a way he noted and filed away. He tried sassafras, root chips mixed with the hickory, which gave the smoke a sweetness underneath the savory that worked particularly well with game birds. He tried applewood from a wild tree on the south face. He tried oak, which was dependable and honest and plain. He tried green cedar once out of curiosity and opened every window in the operations mental ledger to record the result, bitter resinous, completely inedible. A mistake worth making once and recording clearly enough to never make again. He kept meticulous records of everything, each piece of meat weighed before and after. Brine time noted, smoking schedule logged, cave temperature recorded morning and evening, outside temperature at alongside and so he could track the differential. Which wood, what combination, what duration, what result. His notebooks filled steadily, a precise, unhurried hand moving across pages in the candlelight, building a body of knowledge that had no precedent because no one had ever done this in quite this way before. November deepened. The first real snow came on the 7th of the month, a wet, heavy fall that bent the chestnut saplings and turned the ridge into a white silence that was almost absolute. Then it melted. Then came the freezing rain in the third week, coating every surface in a quarter-inch of ice that made the trail down to the valley a cascade of glass and closed off his access to the world below as effectively as any wall. December buried the ridge under 2 feet of snow and kept it there. January arrived with the specific cruelty of a Kentucky mountain, winter settling in for a serious stay, temperatures dropping to 4 below zero. On the coldest night, a cold so hard it split the sap in the chestnut oaks with a rifle crack sound that punctuated the darkness every half hour like a clock with no concern for comfort. Caleb survived on venison and dried corn and wild persimmons he had gathered in October and stored on a cold stone shelf near the cave entrance, and hickory nuts he had collected by the bushel and cached in a stone-lined pit. He ate regularly, not abundantly, and he was warmer than he had any right to be. When he built a small fire for cooking just enough to heat his skillet and boil water for his morning coffee, the cave temperature climbed to the mid-60s and held there for hours after the fire was out. The stone remembered warmth the way good soil remembers rain. The solitude of those winter months was something he had not quite prepared for. Not loneliness exactly, he had always been most himself in his own company, but the sheer volume of silence was its own kind of presence. Days passed where the only sounds were the wind working through the bare trees on the ridgeline, and the occasional territorial commentary of a crow, and the steady, soft sigh of the cave's breath at his back when he sat near the entrance watching the snow accumulate on the oak branches. He talked to Bishop, who bore it with characteristic indifference. He talked to himself more often than he would have admitted to anyone below. He read Lyle by candlelight until certain passages had relocated from the page into something more like memory, and he filled the margins with his own observations, the layering of the limestone walls, the fracture patterns in the ceiling that indicated ancient stress, the mineral staining that told a story of water that had moved through here when the mountain was young and then decided to go elsewhere. He was not unhappy. That was the thing that surprised him most. He had left the valley with the deed of a parcel everyone agreed was worthless, with a mule that bit people with a crate of books and a chest of tools and 40 acres of north-facing rock, and in the deep January cold with the trail buried under 3 feet of drifted snow and no human voice within 7 miles in any direction. He was not unhappy. He was occupied. He was curious. He was warm. By February, he had more cured meat than he could eat in the remaining months of winter. He had also begun to understand in the way that understanding arrives not all at once, but in accumulating weight, that what he had built inside this mountain was not just a means of his own survival. It was something no one had built before, something that could feed more than one person if the trail to the valley floor ever cleared. The creek ice cracked in late February with a sound he felt in his feet before he heard it with his ears. In March, the persimmon saplings on the south slope put out their cautious first leaves. The trail down began to show itself through the thinning snow, and Bishop stood at the cave entrance each morning for 2 weeks looking down the mountain with an expression of pointed suggestion. In early March of 1852, when the trail had cleared enough to descend without risking a broken leg on the ice, Caleb packed a canvas bag with 20 pounds of smoked venison and turkey, loaded it across Bishop's back, and walked down to Harlan for the first time since September. The sky was hard blue and the air smelled of mud and snowmelt and the particular sharp sweetness that eastern Kentucky hollows exhales in early spring when the ground is thawing and the sap is moving and the whole valley is waking up from something it had been meaning to sleep through anyway. He knew what people said about him. The hunter who occasionally passed near his camp had told him without cruelty that Edmund and Roy had been telling people in town that their youngest brother had gone simple in the head, had taken to living in a hole in the ground, like a bear had lost whatever marginal quality he'd previously possessed. He'd heard the pity and the amusement both. He carried the canvas bag of meat and Bishop's halter rope and did not hurry. He found the general store first. Silas Pruitt ran at a man in his 50s with the deliberate, unimpressed manner of someone who had seen enough of human folly to stop being surprised by it, and who had developed over decades of commerce a talent for evaluating products with his senses before his opinions. He looked at the meat Caleb set on his counter with the professional skepticism of a man who has been trying to be fooled his whole career and has not yet succeeded. He picked up a piece, turned it over, held it to the window. He examined the surface the way the cure had penetrated the color distribution, the fine threads of rendered fat running through the muscle fibers. Then he cut a thin slice with his pocket knife and put it in his mouth. He chewed, swallowed, cut another slice, chewed that one more slowly, his eyes narrowing in the way of someone concentrating on something worth concentrating on. Then he held a third slice up to the window light and looked at it for a long time before he said anything. The color alone tells me something different happened here. He offered 12 cents a pound, 3 times the going rate for common smoked meat, and asked whether Caleb could supply 20 pounds by the following Saturday. Caleb said he could. He walked out of the store with $2.40 and the deed to 40 acres of worthless hillside in his coat pocket, and the morning light was coming off the courthouse square at the angle that turns everything gold for about 20 minutes in early spring in the mountains, and Bishop was standing at the hitching post, looking at him with an expression that might, under generous interpretation, have been satisfaction. Word traveled the way it always travels in mountain communities, not through announcement, but through the accumulation of small observations, one remark adding to the next like stones laid in a wall. Pruitt mentioned the meat to the farmer who came in that afternoon for seed corn, who tried a slice and bought a pound, and mentioned it to 3 other people before he reached his wagon. A woman who kept the boarding house on the Lexington Road heard about it from the preacher's wife and placed an order for 10 pounds a week. By late April, Caleb was supplying 3 merchants in Harlan and had the beginning of something he had not arrived at Black Ridge to build a livelihood, a reputation, and a reason to keep going down the mountain. He stood at the cave entrance that first warm evening of April, with the valley spread below him in the late light, the Clover Fork glinting between its banks, the patchwork of fields and woodlots making the distance look quilted and domestic, and he felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with what a man becomes when the thing he was doing in secret turns out to be the most useful thing anyone in the valley has seen in a while. Not pride exactly, something quieter. The sensation of having asked the mountain a question and received an honest answer. Keep asking questions, he thought, until the mountain gives you something. It always gives you something if you know how to listen. Bishop stamped once on the stone shelf outside the entrance, deeply unimpressed by the philosophy, and Caleb went inside to tend the fire. The spring of 1852 taught him the difference between surviving alone and building something. The distinction was not philosophical. It was physical, measurable in the weight of canvas bags, in the frequency of descents to the valley, and the growing list of things he needed that he could not make himself. Salt, nails, cornmeal in quantities larger than he could carry in one trip, a proper draw knife to replace the borrowed one he'd been using on the door frames. These were the demands of a going concern, and a going concern was what Black Ridge had become without Caleb deciding it. By May, he had expanded his operation in the only direction available to him deeper. The limestone in the rear wall of the main chamber, he discovered, was softer than the sandstone of the entrance, a different geological layer, more porous, more responsive to the chisel's argument. He could cut into it at a rate of roughly 6 inches per day when working steadily, which produced a rhythm of progress slow enough to be discouraging if he thought about it in total, and satisfying enough to sustain him if he thought about it in daily increments. He chose the daily increment. He cut new alcoves along the east wall, rough-hewn shelving that held his provisions and tools, and growing collection of notebooks above the clay floor. He extended the rear of the main smoking chamber by 12 feet over the course of the summer, deepening the distance the smoke had to travel before it reached the hanging meat, giving it more time to cool and diffuse into the consistency he wanted. He also carved out a separate curing room, a smaller chamber off the main passage behind a low threshold that required ducking to enter, where the temperature held 1 to 2 degrees cooler than the main chamber, and the air moved slightly less, creating conditions better suited to the long, slow, week-long cures he had begun experimenting with for larger cuts. A whole ham, a turkey cured intact rather than jointed. He was learning to think in timescales longer than a meal, which is to say he was learning to think like a craftsman rather than a hunter. The money coming in from Pruitt's store and the 2 other merchants he now supplied was modest by any measure a man in the valley would apply to it. But it was steady, and steady was something the valley itself had not always been. He bought what he needed and banked the rest against necessity, which in his experience arrived without announcing itself and expected you to be prepared. He was in town on a Saturday in late April of 1854 when Marta Brower walked into Pruitt's store and changed the geometry of his life without either of them noticing it immediately. She was 27 years old, small and sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun that left her face unframed and fully visible. She moved through the store with the purposeful economy of someone who had grown up in a workshop, who had learned early that space was for working in and not for occupying. She was buying nails, not a random handful, but a specific count of a specific gauge, which she identified without consulting a list, and a length of ash for a chair repair she described to Pruitt in enough technical detail that the older man had deferred to her judgment on the wood selection. Her father, Carl Brower, had been a master furniture maker who had brought his tools and his discipline from his family's tradition to a workshop in Louisville, where he had built a reputation for precision joinery, and then died of cholera the previous year, leaving his family with debt and a shop full of finished pieces that sold slowly into a market that did not always know what it was looking at. Marta had come to Harlan to stay with an aunt while she determined what to do with the rest of her life, which was the polite framing for a situation that was actually about surviving the combination of grief and financial pressure that follows when the person who taught you everything is gone and the world he prepared you for has not prepared anything for you in return. She noticed Caleb's delivery rack before she noticed Caleb. It was a carrying frame he had built to transport the weekly supply of smoked meat from Bishop's back to the store counter, 4-sided open slatted for ventilation, designed to be lifted off the mule's pack frame and set directly on the counter without disturbing the arrangement of the meat inside. He had jointed the corners with precision dovetails cut by hand with his pocket knife and a small chisel fitted without glue, because he'd been out of hide glue for 3 months and had found the mechanical joint alone was sufficient if the angles were right. She put down the nails. She picked up the rack and tilted it to the window light, running her thumb along the corner joint with the particular pressure of someone reading a text they already know how to read. She checked for gaps. There were none. Her voice was direct, unhurried. "You made this yourself." He said he had. She turned the rack to him in the opposite corner with the same methodical attention, the same absence of performance. Then she said, "The grain on the upright members runs the wrong way for a carrying piece. Cross grain on a load-bearing element, it'll split if you drop it hard enough." She set the rack back on the counter, picked up her nails, and left. She was right. He rebuilt the rack that week with the grain running lengthwise, and the following Saturday he was back at Pruitt's counter when she was in the conversation that started about ash versus oak for structural members and chairs, became over the next several Saturdays something larger. They talked about wood selection and finished chemistry and the specific problems of building outdoor structures in a climate that cycled through freeze-thaw more than 90 times a year. She had opinions on all of it, grounded in the kind of knowledge that comes from watching a craftsman work, rather than from reading about craftsmanship. And she expressed those opinions with a directness he found clarifying in the way that cold water is clarifying, not always comfortable, but always honest. The conversations lasted longer each week. He found himself noting observations during the week that he thought might be worth raising with her, then discarding the rehearsal when Saturday came and simply speaking honestly instead. Because dishonesty, even the small dishonesty of planned spontaneity, felt wrong in her presence, in a way he couldn't fully explain and didn't try to. In June, he invited her to see the cave. She considered the invitation for a full minute without speaking, in the way of a person who does not make decisions quickly, but makes them firmly and without revisiting them afterward. The following Tuesday, she rode up the mountain on a borrowed horse, and he showed her everything. The smoking chamber, the firebox construction, the curing room, the draft's behavior, the notebooks stacked on their limestone shelf with their precise daily records. She examined the stonework with her hands as much as her eyes, running her palms along the carved walls, testing the level of the floor with her foot. She stood in the main chamber for a long time, watching the thin smoke from a low-fed fire move across the hanging meat in its steady, unhurried current toward the light. She didn't speak for a while, and he didn't fill the silence, because the silence was doing something. Finally, you built a living machine. Her voice carried something that wasn't quite wonder and wasn't quite professional respect, but was made of both. The cave does most of the work. You just had the sense to let it. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about what he had accomplished, and he felt something shift in his chest that had been placed wrong for a long time. They were married in October of that year in the small Methodist church in Harlan, with Pruitt as one witness and Marta's aunt as the other, in a gathering of perhaps 30 people, most of whom had come because word had spread that the youngest Holt brother, the one who lived in a cave and smoked meat, that serious people drove from 2 counties away to buy, had found someone who understood what he was doing. The wedding supper was held in the timber-framed lean-to he had built against the cave entrance, which he had expanded and improved over the summer, until it was a proper room with a plank floor and a window cut through the rock face to let in the afternoon light. Marta brought her father's cabinet-making tools in a cloth-wrapped bundle, a trunk of books in English, and the kind of disposition that is equal parts tenderness and iron, and knows exactly which one a given moment requires. The years immediately following were years of building in every sense. Marta transformed what had been a functional but improvised space into something that worked with intention. She built shelving systems for the curing room that she designed over 2 evenings on paper and executed in 3 days, doubling the hanging capacity without adding floor space, the angles calculated to maximize airflow across every piece. She designed a ventilation door for the entrance, a hinged wooden panel with adjustable louvered slats that allowed them to modulate the airflow without opening the door entirely, giving them control over the draft speed that Caleb had never had before. With the louvers partially closed on very cold nights, they could slow the draft and conserve the cave's accumulated warmth. In summer, open wide, the louvers accelerated the flow and kept the curing temperature from creeping too high. She kept the business records in a leather-bound ledger she had brought from her father's workshop, her handwriting as clean and exact as her joinery, organizing Caleb's notebooks into a system he could reference quickly rather than search through linearly. Profit margins per product type, seasonal supply projections, brine cost calculations with the salt prices noted alongside so the margins could be recalculated when prices shifted. He had been operating by instinct and memory. She gave the instinct a structure that other people could read. Owen was born in 1856, their first child arriving in early spring when the cave's temperature was at its steadiest, and the dogwoods on the south slope were making their annual argument for hope. He was a serious infant who became a serious child, quiet, observant, given to sitting in the corner of the smoking chamber, watching the fire's behavior, with the focused attention of someone taking notes even before he had the vocabulary to take notes with. By the time he was 7, he could identify wood species by smell alone and could tell you the temperature differential between the front and back of the curing room with an accuracy that embarrassed the thermometer. In 1857 came Ruth, whose disposition was her mother's iron, without the accompanying patience, fierce and outward-facing, in love with the valley below, rather than the mountain above, always slightly restless on the ridge, as though she could hear something in the distance that needed attending to. These two children were raised in the cave's warmth, and it marked them in ways that took years to become visible. It was in the summer of 1855 that Gordon Ash came up the mountain. He was a large man who moved in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has spent decades making decisions that cost other people money when they were wrong. He bought smoked pork for a packing operation in Cincinnati and had heard about the Black Ridge product from a merchant in Middlesboro who had begun ordering regularly and had mentioned with the enthusiasm of someone who does not often find himself so surprised by cured meat that there was something happening in a cave in Harlan County that he had not encountered before. Ash spent 2 hours examining everything, asking questions that were technical enough to confirm he understood what he was looking at. He studied the firebox construction, traced the flue channel carved into the floor with his boot, looked at the hang height of the curing racks, and calculated the smoke's travel time over the meat in his head. He tasted the venison. He tasted the turkey. He tasted the smoked pork loin that Caleb had been developing for 6 months, a cut brine for 14 days in a solution of salt sorghum, molasses cracked pepper, and dried sage from the ridge, then dried in the curing room for a full day before going into the smoke for 3 weeks on a schedule of 4 hours on and 8 hours off that he had arrived at through a process of careful failure. Ash ate 3 slices of the pork without speaking. He sat down on a stone ledge and looked at the cave ceiling for a moment, then looked at Caleb with an expression that was part calculation and part something older and less professional. Conventional smokehouses run between 40 degrees on a cold night and 130 on a sunny afternoon. His voice was flat and exact, the voice of a man citing data rather than making a point. That range produces inconsistent cures. Meat dry on the outside and undertreated at the center. Off flavors from bacterial growth during warm spells. I've been managing that problem for 18 years. He looked around at the stone walls, at the smoke moving in its steady current, at the thermometer, reading on its limestone shelf. You've eliminated it. The contract he offered was 200 pounds of smoked pork per month delivered to the Cumberland Gap railhead at 20 cents per pound. $40 a month from 40 acres of rock that wouldn't keep a goat alive. Caleb accepted. The contract changed the operation's scale and therefore changed the work's nature, which is what scale always does. He needed a reliable supply of pigs, which he arranged with 2 farms in the valley whose owners were practical enough to see the value in a steady buyer who paid market price on time. He built a stone-lined pen on the flatter ground below the cave entrance and discovered in the process of digging the drainage channel a seep in the hillside that produced a steady trickle of cold spring water enough for the pigs and for the household, and for the brine vats he was now running continuously. He hired 2 young men from the valley to help with the butchering and hauling, teaching them his methods with the same precision he brought to his notebooks. He told them not just what to do, but why how salt drew moisture from the meat through osmosis, creating a surface chemistry hostile to the microorganisms that cause spoilage. How the phenols and acids in the smoke created a second layer of chemical protection that conventional salt curing alone couldn't achieve. How the cave's temperature stability eliminated the single largest variable in curing, which was not skill or recipe, but weather. He was not a man who taught by withholding. A secret is a dead thing, he told them once when one of the young men asked whether he worried about teaching away his advantage. It dies with the man who keeps it. But knowledge shared is alive. It grows into things you couldn't have predicted and comes back to you changed. The summer of 1856 arrived with a malice that was not forecast. Kentucky mountain summers ran hot, but they cycled a week of serious heat, a week of relief, the altitude of Black Ridge providing 10 to 15 degrees of advantage over the valley. The summer of 1856 did not cycle. July came in above 90 degrees and stayed there for 16 days and then stayed longer, the kind of heat that makes stone walls sweat and turns the air into something you negotiate with rather than breathe. Caleb had arranged the first major fulfillment of the Ash contract, 180 pounds of smoked pork, his best production, yet prepared with particular care because the steaks were no longer local. He had loaded the meat into the standard wooden crates he'd been using for local delivery, packed tight in cheesecloth to prevent contact between pieces, and sent it with his 2 hired men by wagon down the mountain to the Cumberland Gap railhead for the 3-day journey to Cincinnati. What he had not fully calculated was the interaction between 3 days of wagon travel in 95-degree heat, and a wooden container with no insulating properties beyond its own sides. The cave's conditions ended at the cave entrance. Everything beyond that point belonged to the weather. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. Ash's handwriting was as spare and exact as his speech. One-third of the shipment had shown signs of spoilage on arrival's surface, color inconsistent, smell altered. The contract was suspended pending explanation. Caleb read the letter at the entrance to the cave, standing in the July heat that pressed against the mountain's face while the cool breath of the interior moved past him. He had the specific sensation of a man who has been very careful about the things he can control and has not been careful enough about the things he cannot. He was not wrong about the cave. The cave had performed exactly as it always did. He was wrong about the boundary of the cave's influence and wrong about what happened to his work once it crossed that boundary into the jurisdiction of ordinary weather. He was 40 minutes in the wrong direction before something specific and useful replaced the wrong feeling. He went back inside him and sat at the table Marta had built from black walnut and looked at the problem from the direction of the solution rather than the direction of the error. The meat needed to stay at curing temperature through the journey. That meant the container had to do what the cave did not replicate it, which was impossible but approximate its insulating function well enough to keep the internal temperature below the threshold of spoilage for 3 days of summer travel. Stone was not portable, but the principle of thermal mass was not exclusive to stone. A thick wooden wall with a dead air space between two layers would provide insulation. Salt packed between the layers would add thermal mass. An inner tray system that kept the pieces separated and ventilated would prevent the contact spoilage that occurred when cured meats pressed against each other in transit. He brought the problem to Marta that evening. She listened without interrupting, which was her way of indicating that she was taking the problem seriously enough to solve it rather than respond to it. She took out paper and began drawing while they talked, the pencil moving in quick, confident strokes that were already ahead of the conversation. 6 weeks of work produced a shipping barrel unlike anything in current use along the Cumberland Gap trade route. Double-walled oak construction with a packed salt layer between the walls, the inner chamber lined with cedar for its natural antimicrobial properties, and an internal tray system of Marta's design, interlocking removable slats that held each piece of meat separated from its neighbors at a 1/4-inch spacing, allowing air to circulate across every surface, even in a packed barrel. The lid sealed with a Cooper joint precise enough to maintain internal atmosphere. They tested it through a week of July heat, checking the internal temperature twice daily, and found it held 5 to 8 degrees cooler than the outside air across the full span of the test. Caleb sent a small shipment, 20 pounds no invoice, to Ash at the Cincinnati address with a single accompanying note. He described the new container design, its construction, and the temperature data from the test week. He asked for nothing. Ash responded in 10 days. The shipment had arrived in excellent condition. He wanted to discuss increasing the monthly volume. When they met again at Cumberland Gap, Ash examined the barrel with the same methodical attention he'd given the cave. He pulled the inner tray system out and turned it over in his hands, fitting the slats together and apart, feeling the tolerances of the joinery. Then, who designed this? Caleb said his wife's name. Ash nodded, once the gesture of a man filing away information that will be useful. The barrel solved a problem I've had with every smoked meat supplier I work with. Your wife just solved it. He paused. Tell her. He came home and told her. Marta was in the curing room checking hang weights when he relayed the message, and she received it the way she received most praise, with a brief nod and a return to the work at hand, as though the acknowledgement were accurate and therefore not worth excessive attention. But he had known her long enough to see the small adjustment in her posture, the one that meant something had landed and mattered, even if she wasn't going to perform it. The contract increased to 300 pounds per month. The cave expanded along with the business. Caleb and Owen, who at 9 years old in 1865 had begun his own career as an explorer of the deeper passages, returning from crawl-length expeditions with specimens of calcite crystal and fossilized shells embedded in limestone that he arranged in careful rows on a shelf his mother had built for the purpose, spent weekends through 1865 and 1866 extending the carved chambers. A second alcove off the primary passage. A deeper firebox housing cut further back in the rock where the temperature held even more stable. New hanging positions at varied heights, which Caleb had learned produced subtly different curing rates useful for different product types. Edmund lost the East Pasture to the Lexington Bank in 1859. Caleb heard about it from Pruitt, who reported it without embellishment and without pleasure, the way a man shares news that he knows will land with weight, but believes should be spoken clearly rather than packaged. Edmund had leveraged the bottomland against a hemp operation that the political disruptions of the late 50s had made unworkable, and the bank's patience had a documented end date that arrived. Roy had fared worse in a different direction. The expanded mill he'd built on borrowed capital sat idle through the drought year, its wheel turning in a trickle that couldn't power a lantern, while the machinery payments to the Pittsburgh manufacturer arrived with the punctuality of consequences. Caleb sent a smoked ham to Edmund's wife at Christmas of that year, packed in one of the new cedar-lined barrels with no note. It was returned unopened, and he understood this as the last communication between them on terms that required interpretation, and he let it be what it was. The war came in April of 1861 and arrived in Harlan County the way a stone arrives in water, the initial impact at the center and the rings moving outward until they reached every edge. Kentucky's official neutrality lasted 4 months before it became the fiction everyone had always known it was. The county divided along lines that had been drawn by economics and family history and old grievances long before the politicians got around to formalizing them. Men who had traded at the same Saturday market for 20 years found themselves on opposite sides of something that had no Saturday anymore. Caleb's position was difficult in a way that was different from most people's difficult positions because his difficulty was not about conviction, but about function. He cared about what was happening. He cared in the specific way of a man who watched the boys from the Valley Hollows go down the road in homespun, carrying borrowed rifles, and who heard months later how many of them did not come back and how many of those who did come back were not the same shape they'd left in. He was not indifferent. Indifference would have been easier. But he had understood for a long time that caring and choosing sides were different actions with different consequences, and that in a county where men were being shot for the wrong answer to a question asked at the wrong crossroads, a man with 6 employees and a wife and 2 children and a third on the way had obligations that ran in multiple directions. He supplied smoked meat to Union families and Confederate families, without distinction, taking payment in either case and volunteering his sympathies in neither. It kept him alive. It also kept his workers employed and Marta's woodworking school operating and the smoke moving through the cave, which meant the meat kept coming down the mountain and people kept eating. Pruitt, who was quietly unionist, asked him once where his sympathies lay. Caleb's answer was, with the hogs. Pruitt did not laugh, but he nodded, which meant he understood that it was not entirely a joke. Marta's work during the war years was less ambiguous. When a family of 11, a mother, a grandmother, and 9 children ranging from an infant to a boy of 14, appeared at the bottom of the Switchback Trail on a January night in 1863, with nothing beyond the clothes they were wearing and the information that their farm had been burned in the previous afternoon's raiding, she brought them up the mountain and into the cave's warmth, and kept them there for 6 weeks while arrangements were made. She fed them from the Smokehouse stores without accounting for the mod. She put the older children to work in ways that gave them something to do with their hands during hours that would otherwise have been occupied by fear. She turned no one away during those years. That was not a policy decision. It was simply who she was, and the cave was large enough and warm enough, and the stores were sufficient, and so it happened. Daniel arrived in October of 1862, the year's darkest month and the county's darkest year. A quiet infant who watched everything from the beginning with eyes that seemed to be composing what they saw rather than merely receiving it. He had his mother's precision and his father's patience and something else that was his own, a talent for rendering that became visible as soon as he could hold a stick of charcoal. By the time he was 5, he was producing drawings of the cave's interior that were accurate enough to navigate by. The war's most direct threat to everything Caleb had built arrived in October of 1864, and it arrived by the road he had made. He had spent the better part of the previous summer with 2 hired men building a proper trail up Black Ridge, a switchback road engineered with the same care he brought to everything the grade calculated, at no steeper than 1 foot in 10 stone-lined drainage channels placed where water naturally wanted to run, retaining walls at the outside of each turn to hold the fill against the slope's hunger for it. The road had taken nearly all of that summer to build and had represented, when it was finished, a feat of planning and physical work that he was more quietly proud of than almost anything else he had made. It meant a wagon could reach the cave entrance. It meant larger shipments and better access and the gradual transformation of Black Ridge from a remote hermitage into something that could support a real operation. It also meant that anything that could follow a road could now follow this one. He heard them before he saw the glow of their torches, a sound that was wrong in the way a sound is wrong when it belongs to the valley below and has no business on this ridge at this hour. Multiple horses moving with the purposeful rhythm of a group that knows where it's going. He stepped to the cave entrance and looked down the slope into the darkness and saw the torchlight coming up through the switchbacks one level, then the next, the light appearing and disappearing as the trail curved, counting at least a dozen riders. Confederate cavalry markings on the horses nearest the torches, but the particular looseness of movement that distinguished irregulars from disciplined soldiers, men who wore the uniform for its protection rather than its obligation. Owen was asleep in the back chamber. Ruth was 7 years old and asleep beside him. Daniel was 2. Marta stood at the cave entrance beside Caleb and did not speak. He stood still and thought. The road had one structural weakness. A plank bridge he had built across a 6-foot drainage cut at the third switchback, the point where the grade reversed and the road swung hard to the east. Without the bridge, the drainage cut was impassable to horses. With it, the road was open all the way to the entrance. The bridge was 40 yards of timber that had taken 3 days to build. It was also currently 50 yards below the riders who had not yet reached the third switchback. He picked up the torch he kept inside the entrance. He looked at Marta once. She said, "Go." He went down the slope at an angle that avoided the road moving through the dark trees by memory of the terrain and reached the bridge before the riders came around the second turn. He drove the torch into the gap between the main timber and the first plank and held it there until the flame took dry summer wood catching in a way that required only patience. And then he stepped back onto the solid ground of the upper slope and watched the bridge begin to go. The fire caught fully in under 2 minutes. The riders rounded the second switchback and saw it and stopped their horses, pulling back from the noise and the light. There was shouting, the rough, unfocused anger of men who have been inconvenienced rather than stopped, and then the sounds of assessment, the particular silence of a group deciding whether the obstacle was worth the effort it would cost. It was not. The drainage cut was 6 feet deep at its narrowest point, and they had no tools. The shouting became argument, and the argument became retreat, and the torches went back down the mountain in the direction they'd come from. Caleb stood at the ruin of his bridge and watched the fire finish what he'd started. The road he had spent a summer building now had a 40-yard gap at its third switchback, as effective as if the mountain had swallowed that section entirely. He stood there for a while after the last torch disappeared below the tree line, listening to the fire settle into embers and the forest reclaim its usual sound. He had destroyed the thing he was most proud of to protect the thing he loved most. That was not a complicated equation, but it sat in his chest in a complicated way, the way losses do when they are the right choice and still losses. He came back up to the cave entrance where Marta was waiting. They stood together in the dark for a while without speaking, the cave's warmth coming past them both into the October air. Then he said, "I'll build it back." Her answer was quiet and absolute. "I know you will." They went inside. He rebuilt the bridge the following spring, but not in wood this time. He quarried stone from the drainage cut walls and mortared it with the same cave clay he'd used for the firebox, building a low arch that would not burn and would not rot and would hold the weight of a loaded freight wagon for longer than either of them would live to measure. The arch took 6 weeks and 2 hired men and a considerable amount of calculation, and when it was finished, he stood on it and jumped twice, which was as close as he came to celebration. The war ended in April of 1865 and left behind it a silence in the county that was louder than the conflict had been. The silence of people trying to remember how to live among each other again and not always finding the memory. Farms had been left untended. Fences had been pulled for firewood. The labor structure of the valley had changed in ways that were still working themselves out in real time, and the men who had gone to war and come back were not the same shape they'd left in as Caleb had known they would not be. The demand for quality smoked meat increased sharply in the war's aftermath, which was not a surprise. 4 years of hardtack and salt pork had created a hunger for craft that was partly about food and partly about the proof that craft still existed, that someone somewhere had been tending something through all of it and that the result was worth the wait. Caleb expanded again. He hired additional workers, 6 full-time by 1867, drawing from the valley families who needed steady work and were willing to learn. He took 2 apprentices each autumn, young men from the mountain communities, who came for room and board and a share of the product and left after a season or two carrying the full method in their hands and heads, going out to their own communities and building their own operations. He did not patent his technique. He did not guard it. He taught it completely withholding nothing because he had understood something about knowledge that his brothers had never understood about land. The more you give of it, the more of it there is. Roy sold the west parcel in pieces through the late 60s. The timber stand first, then the mill structure, then the bottomland that had been in the Holt family for 3 generations. That soil dark and deep as coffee grounds the land that had fed them all. Harriet left in 1867, taking a trunk of clothes and a silence that carried more content than anything she'd said during their marriage. Roy ended up with 5 acres no one wanted, in a 2-room cabin, in the particular kind of solitude that arrives when the choices you made freely have simply finished arriving at their conclusions. Caleb visited him once in October of 1876 on a day when the valley's color was at its annual peak. Maples burning red, hickories gone to gold, the oaks still holding their green as though skeptical of the urgency. Roy was on the porch in a coat too large for the man he'd become, and his hands resting in his lap like tools someone had set down without thinking. He was 60 years old and looked older in the specific way of men whose energy has gone into resistance rather than construction. Roy said, "You always were the smart one." And Caleb corrected him gently, "Not smart, curious. Those are different things." Roy looked at him. "How so?" Caleb thought about it before he answered because he always thought before he answered when the question was worth answering. Smart means you know the answers. Curious means you keep asking questions until something gives you one. They sat for an hour and drank coffee from the tin flask Caleb had brought, and they watched a red-tailed hawk making slow, deliberate circles over the pasture below, and the silence between them was not hostile, but simply the silence of 2 men who had traveled in such different directions from the same starting point that the distance could not be measured in anything as simple as miles. Before he left, Caleb told his brother that he was welcome at Black Ridge any time and meant it without reservation or condition. Roy looked up at the ridge, at the dark line of it above the trees that the place's youngest brother had turned into something no one in this county had imagined, when a thin man in a parlor had pointed at a cross-hatched square on a survey map. He nodded slowly. He never came. By the late 1870s, the Black Ridge Smokehouse, the name had appeared on its own, spoken first by someone in town and then by everyone, was processing over 1,000 pounds of product a month. Caleb employed 6 workers full-time. The trail had been improved twice more since the stone bridge repair each iteration, adding width and better drainage, and a wagon could now reach the cave entrance in reasonable weather without drama. He had built a proper timber frame building against the cave face, part storefront, part packing room, with a broad porch facing the valley that commanded a view of the entire Clover Fork drainage, the ridges floating above the morning mist like islands in something that wasn't quite water. Marta's woodworking school had outgrown the lean-to she'd started in and moved into the new building's rear section where she taught on Saturdays through most of the year. Hand tool technique, wood selection, joinery, design, and what she called the discipline of material, by which she meant the practice of understanding what a piece of wood wanted to do before you decided what you wanted it to do. 40 students a year, mostly women and girls from the mountain communities, though she turned no one away on the basis of anything. She charged nothing. She believed, as Caleb did, that skill was a form of wealth that compounded through distribution. The furniture she built in those years, chairs and tables and cabinets, of Kentucky cherry and black walnut and chestnut, and all of it seasoned in the cave's curing room, where the controlled humidity produced a slow drying that prevented warping, began appearing in homes throughout eastern Kentucky, recognized by a joinery precision that required no signature. One evening, watching the smoke move in its familiar, slow current from the deep firebox to the cave entrance, Caleb thought about the morning 25 years before, when he had stood in a parlor and listened to his brothers divide the world. He thought about the deed in his coat pocket and the 7-mile climb in the rain and the hand he had pressed into a gap in a rock wall, and felt warmth coming out of the mountain like a quiet answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. He thought about all of it without sentiment the way you think about a road. You know, well, not with nostalgia for when you first walked it, but with the settled familiarity of a man who understands every turn. The cave had been here before him. It would be here after him. His contribution to it was attention and patience and the willingness to ask questions until the stone answered. That was enough. He had come to understand exactly enough and not one thing more. The reputation of a thing travels differently than the thing itself. The smoked meat from Black Ridge traveled in barrels packed in cedar-lined oak on Marta's interlocking tray system, loaded onto wagons that descended the Switchback Trail and connected eventually to the Cumberland Gap railhead, and from there to markets in Lexington and Louisville and points beyond. But the reputation traveled the older way, in the mouths of teamsters and boarding house keepers and Saturday auction men who had tasted something they could not adequately describe to someone who hadn't tasted it and who kept trying anyway because the inability to describe something accurately has never in human history prevented people from trying. By 1880, the name Black Ridge Smokehouse appeared in correspondence from merchants Caleb had never met, in towns he had never visited, requesting product and asking questions about availability. A hotel in Lexington had put the smoked bacon on its breakfast menu and found that guests mentioned it specifically in their letters home, which is the restaurant equivalent of a scientific proof, not one person's enthusiasm, but a pattern repeated enough to constitute evidence. A Louisville newspaper had sent a correspondent to write about the operation in 1882, a young man who arrived on horseback, having never been higher than the first switchback in his life, and who stood in the smoking chamber with an expression Caleb recognized as the same one most first-time visitors wore, a combination of spatial surprise at the cave's scale and sensory surprise at the way the smoke moved, not like smoke in an open room, but with a purposefulness that made it seem, as more than one person had remarked, like something the cave was doing rather than something happening inside it. The resulting article called Caleb the Philosopher of Smoke, a phrase he read once and set aside without comment because he found it simultaneously accurate and useless, the way most descriptions of a thing are less informative than the thing itself. What the article did accurately was describe the cave in enough physical and atmospheric detail that readers who had never been to Harlan County could form a picture of it, and what the picture produced in those readers was curiosity of the kind that leads to travel. People came from Nashville, from Cincinnati, from as far as Chicago, some to buy, some to observe, a few who arrived with notebooks and the look of men who intended to replicate what they saw elsewhere and had not yet realized that the cave's conditions were not a technique, but a location, and that Black Ridge was the only Black Ridge. Caleb received all of them with the same patient courtesy he brought to everything, showed them the firebox, explained the flue channel, described the temperature differential, and the draft mechanics in language as plain and exact as his notebook entries. He answered every question completely. He hid nothing. He had said to his hired men years before that a secret is a dead thing, and he meant it in a way that went beyond business strategy. He had been given 40 acres of rock by men who wanted to make him small, and he had found inside that rock something that fed 3 towns. The last thing he intended to do with that gift was hoard it. The autumn of 1884 brought Dr. Harold Whitfield up the mountain on a different kind of errand. He was a professor of geology at the University of Kentucky, tall, wire-spectacled, possessing an enthusiasm for limestone that his students described as bordering on the evangelical, and that Caleb recognized within the first hour as the enthusiasm of a man who has found the subject that matches the shape of his mind. Whitfield had read the 1882 newspaper article and had written to Caleb requesting permission to study the cave system itself, rather than the smokehouse operation, which he considered not impolitely a secondary consequence of the geology rather than the primary event. He came with measuring instruments and glass sample bottles and a set of surveying tools he had borrowed from the university's engineering department, and he brought with him a young research assistant who was largely responsible for carrying everything up the mountain. He spent 3 days in the cave with Daniel, who at 22 had completed his art studies in Cincinnati and returned to Black Ridge with a draftsman's eye and a surveyor's patience, and who had been quietly mapping the cave's passages in his spare time for several years, already producing cross-sections and floor plans of an accuracy that surprised Whitfield when he saw them. The two of them crawled into passages that Caleb had explored only cursorily And Caleb himself had never fully mapped measuring temperatures at intervals, collecting air samples, recording the dimensions of chambers and the angles of fissures with the methodical thoroughness of men who believe that measurement is a form of respect. Whitfield set up a continuous temperature log, recording readings every 6 hours from 3 positions in the cave front chamber, main smoking chamber, and the entrance to the deeper passage beyond the curing room. He recorded wind speed at the entrance using a device he had built himself from a pivot arm and a calibrated scale. On the third evening, he sat with Caleb at the black walnut table in the living chamber and laid out what he had found in a language that was precise enough to be useful and plain enough to be honest. The cave maintained a year-round temperature between 53 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit. The relative humidity ranged between 65 and 75% across all seasons. The airflow was driven by a phenomenon called the chimney effect. Warm air from the cave's interior, rising through fractures and small openings in the rock above the main chamber, creating a pressure differential that drew replacement air from the deeper passages forward through the smoking chamber and out the entrance. The draft averaged approximately 2 miles per hour, which Whitfield noted was barely enough to feel on the back of your hand, but sufficient to move smoke across the hanging meat in a continuous, even distribution that eliminated the dead zones and concentration points that plagued conventional above-ground smokehouses. He also confirmed the natural saltpeter deposits that Caleb had been incorporating into his brine for 30 years. Potassium nitrate formed by bacterial action on the limestone, in the presence of organic material, the same geological process that had made Kentucky caves the primary source of gunpowder, saltpeter during the War of 1812, and again during the conflict 20 years later. The deposits in Caleb's cave were high quality, consistently formed, and effectively inexhaustible at the rate of use Caleb had maintained. Whitfield leaned back in his chair and looked at the limestone ceiling above the table at the walls Caleb had carved and smoothed and whitewashed over 30 years of continuous occupancy. "You've been practicing applied geology for 3 decades without knowing what to call it." Caleb looked at him steadily. "I knew what I was doing, I just didn't know the name for it." When there was a distinction in that sentence that mattered to him, the difference between understanding a thing and being able to classify it was the difference between wisdom and education, and he had always believed wisdom was the more useful of the two. Whitfield published a paper in a scientific journal the following year citing Caleb's notebooks as primary data the first time a working smokehouse had been studied as a geological system rather than as a food production operation. The paper drew attention from agricultural scientists at land-grant universities who were beginning to approach food preservation as a subject of systematic study rather than accumulated folk practice, and who found in Caleb's 30 years of meticulous records a body of empirical data that their own laboratories had not yet produced. Letters arrived from professors and researchers. Caleb answered each one in the same hand he used for his daily temperature logs, careful and complete, withholding nothing. Owen was 28 that autumn and had been managing the daily operations of the smokehouse for 2 years with a competence that had allowed Caleb to step back without stepping away. He had his father's methodical precision and had added to it a theoretical interest in the cave's geology that had deepened through years of reading and correspondence, and his own explorations of the passages beyond the main chambers. He knew the cave's deeper sections better than anyone alive, having crawled their full extent multiple times over the past decade, mapping each chamber and measuring each passage with the instruments Whitfield had shown him how to use. He had begun corresponding with food preservation researchers at universities along the eastern seaboard, exchanging techniques and observations in letters that he shared with Caleb over the evening meal. The two of them working through the chemistry and the physics of what they did every day, in language that was half their own and half borrowed from people who had given the things they knew the names the Holts had been using descriptions for. Owen had also expanded the operation with the same conservatism his father had always brought to growth, not chasing scale for its own sake, but improving the process wherever improvement was available. He had added a second smoking chamber carved deeper into the ridge running off a lateral passage 20 feet past the original curing room, where the temperature held at 54 degrees with a consistency that even the main chamber's 30-year record couldn't quite match. He had introduced new products, a smoked sausage seasoned with sage and red pepper that had found its way onto the menus of 3 restaurants in Lexington, a smoked cheese that spent 6 months in the cave's humidity, developing a flavor complexity that no dairy outside a cave system could replicate, and a cured bacon that the Lexington Grand Hotel had made the centerpiece of its breakfast service, and whose absence on the occasions when a shipment was delayed produced complaints of a specificity that constituted the highest form of culinary compliment. Ruth came back every Sunday from Middlesbrough with her husband, and increasingly with her children, whose relationship to the cave was the entirely unsentimental relationship of people who have grown up around something extraordinary and therefore do not find it extraordinary at all. They ran through the passages and played on the porch and ate their grandmother's food and absorbed without knowing they were absorbing it the particular quality of attention that the Holt family brought to everything it touched. Daniel's book had been taking shape for 3 years by the time Whitfield's visit brought it into sharper focus. He had been working through its structure in the evenings after supper, sketching illustrations through the morning hours, when the light through the rock-cut window was best discussing the technical content with Caleb and Owen at the table over coffee that Marta brewed strong enough to hold a spoon upright. The book was conceived as something that had not previously existed, a complete technical guide to cave smoking technique that was simultaneously a work of natural history and a manual of craft, the two registers woven together on the premise that you could not understand the technique without understanding the geology and could not fully appreciate the geology without seeing what it made possible. The illustrations were the thing that would make it. Daniel drew with a draftsman's accuracy and an artist's feel for light and space, and his cross-sections of the cave system showed both the physical facts of the formation, the limestone layering, the fracture patterns, the path of the ancient water that had carved the chambers in the human additions to those facts, the firebox housing the flue channels cut into the floor, the hanging positions mapped with the smoke's travel path shown as fine parallel lines moving from the fire to the entrance. His diagrams of butchering and brining and hanging technique were precise enough to teach without a teacher present. His fold-out geological map of the Black Ridge Formation, which he produced in consultation with Whitfield's survey data and his own years of measurement, would later be used by the University of Kentucky as a teaching document in its geology program. Caleb reviewed each section of the manuscript at the table in the evenings, reading carefully and making marginal notes in the same small hand he used for his temperature logs. He was not a vain man and did not read the pages with the self-regard of someone reviewing his own legend. He read them the way he read everything, looking for what was missing, for the places where the description fell short of the experience. It was trying to describe for the errors of emphasis that made something seem simpler or more mysterious than it was. He was above everything a man who wanted things to be accurate. He turned 65 in 1885 and found that the number meant less than he'd expected because his body's inventory of what it could do had not substantially changed from the previous years. He was slower on the trail than he'd been at 40, which was a fact rather than a complaint. His hands had the particular shape of hands that have spent decades gripping tools, the fingers slightly curved even at rest, the palms calloused in specific places that mapped exactly to specific tools, the right hand's grip somewhat stronger than the left in the way of a man who has swung a hammer for 40 years and whose body has simply adapted to the requirement. He still entered the smoking chamber each morning to check the temperature and adjust the draft and examine the hanging meat with the same methodical attention he had brought to that first strip of venison in 1851. The process was as familiar to him as breathing and as necessary. Edmund had died in 1874. Caleb had attended the funeral and stood quietly at the back of the gathering in the Harlan churchyard, feeling not triumph and not grief, but something more complex, the recognition that cruelty born of ordinary smallness was more pitiable than hateful, and that he had stopped carrying the weight of his eldest brother's contempt somewhere in the middle of the war and had not missed it once in the years since. The 1880s were the decade the Black Ridge Smokehouse became something larger than a business, without Caleb intending it. The ash contract had grown steadily and now included a Louisville distribution arrangement that placed the branded barrels, the BRS mark, burned into the oak on every shipping container, Marta's design a stylized mountain outline above the letters and markets throughout the state. Merchants reported that customers sought out the brand, specifically bypassing cheaper alternatives with the particular determination of people who have tasted the original and are unwilling to accept substitutes. This is the best compliment a product can receive, and Caleb received it the way he received most things noted. It understood its meaning and continued working. The porch of the timber frame building had become, in the years since its construction, something more than a loading platform. On autumn mornings when the mist lay in the valley hollows and the ridges above it floated in the thin air like the backs of surfacing animals, the porch commanded a view of the entire Clover Fork drainage that had stopped more than one visitor mid-sentence. People stood there and understood without being told why a man might have chosen this location, why the 40 acres that had seemed like a punishment had turned out to be a door. The mountain had not changed. Only the man looking at it had known what to see. In the autumn of 1888, Caleb was 68 years old, and the first signs of what would come were subtle enough that only Marta saw them clearly, because she had been watching him with the attention that 40 years of partnership produces, the kind of attention that registers not the dramatic change, but the slight adjustment, the pause that wasn't there last year, the preference for sitting that had previously been a preference for standing. He rested more often on the trail. Not stopping, never stopping, because stopping was a different thing than resting, and he knew the difference, but pausing at the flat rock on the second switchback that had always been there as a bench and had previously been ignored. He sat longer at the table after the evening meal before rising. He spent more mornings in the chair near the cave entrance, watching the valley below the October light, moving across the ridge faces in its slow, daily southward progression, the hawks making their tilted circles in the thermal above the hollow. He said nothing about any of this. That was not his way. His way was to note the fact, understand its implications, and continue with what needed doing until continuing was no longer available as an option. The cough arrived in August of 1891 with the particular persistence of something that intends to stay. It was not violent in the beginning, not the kind of cough that stops a room, but it was consistent, and consistency in a symptom carries a different weight than intensity. The doctor in Harlan was a young man who had graduated from a medical school in Cincinnati the year Caleb turned 60, and who had the manner of someone who has learned to deliver honest information without embellishment, because embellishment makes the honest part harder to hear. He listened to Caleb's chest through his instrument for a long time. Then he said what he had to say. Caleb listened to the entire sentence before asking any questions. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical, none of them about how much time. Then he thanked the young doctor and rode Bishop, who was even more ancient, now gray as winter ash, with the profound, unhurried dignity of a creature who has long since decided that urgency is for other people up the mountain, with the deliberate pace of a man who has a specific number of switchbacks ahead of him and intends to reach the top. He asked Marta to walk with him to the smoking chamber that afternoon. They stood together in the familiar dim warmth, the hickory smoke moving in its eternal patient current from the firebox to the entrance light, the hams and bacon sides hanging in their measured positions on the overhead racks. He looked at all of it for a long time. The fire needed tending in 2 hours. The temperature log needed its afternoon entry. Owen would be back from the valley by dark, and there were decisions about the next week's brine schedule to discuss over supper. "Still working," Caleb said. The words came out quietly with the ease of a man stating something obvious, and he smiled not at the smoke or the chamber, but at some private recognition, some conversation he was having with the cave itself. Marta stood beside him and did not say anything, because some moments do not require response, only witness. The weeks that followed were shaped by the same qualities that had shaped his entire life on the mountain: attention, patience, and the refusal to confuse slowing down with stopping. He reviewed Daniel's manuscript pages in the evenings, making his final marginal notes, and the two of them spent those last autumn sessions going over the brine chemistry chapter with a precision that was partly editorial and partly something else, a transmission, the deliberate and careful passing of knowledge from one generation's hands to the next. He talked to Owen about the second smoking chamber's temperature patterns and about the drainage modification Owen had been considering for the 4th switchback. He sat on the porch in the thin October light and watched the ridges across the valley go through their annual reckoning, with color the maples first, then the hickories, the oaks last and most reluctant. Ruth came every Sunday and brought her children, who climbed everything and needed to be retrieved from the deeper passages with a regularity that would have been exhausting if it had not also been evidence of exactly what the cave was supposed to be: a place people wanted to be, inside a place with warmth enough for everyone. The November snow came early that year. On the 2nd of the month, the first flakes appeared in the afternoon sky above Black Ridge, and by evening the ridge was white and the oaks were holding their covering with the careful stillness of things that have learned to bear weight. The quiet that snow brings to a mountain is different from the quiet of any other weather. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of absorption, as though the world has decided to receive everything and give nothing back for a while. On the evening of November 3rd, Caleb asked Owen and Ruth and Daniel to come to his bedside in the living chamber, where he had been resting for the past week, propped on the pillows Ruth had brought from Middlesbrough and wrapped in the quilt she had made for him the previous winter, its pattern a series of interlocking squares in the colors of the mountain seasons. The oil lamp on the limestone shelf threw its steady, warm light across the walls that Caleb had smoothed and whitewashed and occupied for 40 years, walls that held in their grain the compressed history of everything that had happened in this space, the fires, the conversations, the winters endured, the children born, the work done every day without exception. Marta sat beside the bed holding his hand, her face composed in the manner of a woman who has done what private grieving she needed to do and has arrived at this moment prepared to be entirely present for it, which is the hardest form of love. Owen stood at the foot of the bed, his arms at his sides, his expression, the expression of a man trying to hold multiple things at once, grief and steadiness, and the practical weight of what came next in managing all of them imperfectly, which was the most anyone could ask. Ruth knelt beside her mother, her face pressed against the edge of the quilt, fierce in her sorrow the way she had always been fierce in everything. Daniel sat in the chair in the corner with his sketch pad closed on his knee. Some moments were not for rendering, but for receiving quality, and he had understood this without being told. Caleb looked at each of them in the unhurried way he had always looked at things he wanted to understand. Then he spoke. "Keep digging." His voice was quiet but placed with care, each word set down in its position the way he set tools on the workbench deliberately in the right order where they could be found again. There's always more inside the mountain, always more than what you see at first. Owen looked at his father. Something moved in the room that had the quality of a hell breath. Then Owen said something he had not said to anyone yet, and his voice was low and careful, carrying the particular weight of news that has been held back not from secrecy, but from the sense that the right moment was required. "I found it," Owen said, 2 weeks ago, behind the second chamber, the passage I've been measuring for 3 years. It opens into a new room, bigger than the main smoking chamber. The temperature reads 54 degrees across the entire floor wall to wall. No variation. The draft is steadier than anything in the front system. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition, the particular quality of stillness that arrives when something you have worked toward for a long time finally declares itself. Caleb looked at his son for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not surprise. He had always believed the mountain held more than it had shown, but was the specific satisfaction of a man whose life's central premise has been confirmed at the moment when confirmation could not arrive too late to matter. The mountain had kept its deepest room until now. It had waited for the next pair of hands. "Good," Caleb said. The word was simple and absolute and carried the weight of everything he had ever meant by digging deeper, by asking the next question, by pressing your hand into the dark and waiting for what moved against it. Then he looked at Marta, and what passed between them in that look was the full content of 40 years for Murray, morning in the smoking chamber. Every evening at the walnut table, every hard season endured, and Goodwin appreciated the bridge burning and the stone arch built in its place, the children asleep in their carved rooms, the smoke moving in its patient current through the warm heart of the mountain they had made into a home. He closed his eyes with the unhurried completeness of a man who has finished the day's work and set his tools down in their proper places. They buried him 2 days later under the chestnut oak he had marked as his preferred tree during his first week on Black Ridge, 40 years before, 50 yards from the cave entrance, on a flat shelf of ground where the limestone surfaced through the thin soil in a shelf wide enough to stand on. The November sky was the particular silver that follows early snow, thin light, clean air, the kind of clarity that makes distances seem both farther and more available. The snow from the previous night had stopped and left the ridge white and still. Half the county made the climb. Pruitt came 78 years old, walking with a cane, and stood at the grave for a long time without speaking, looking at the grave marker with the expression of a man reviewing an account he had been keeping for a long time and finding it balanced. Workers Caleb had trained came from 3 counties. The children of families Marta had sheltered during the war came now adults with children of their own. People from hollows without names. People who had tasted the meat at a boarding house table 20 years before and had never forgotten it. People who had heard the story and come because the story was the kind that requires you to stand in the place where it happened in order to fully believe it. Daniel carved the headstone himself from a slab of the cave's own limestone, quarried from the wall of the fourth chamber in a section Caleb had cut by hand in 1853. The letters were plain and deep cut to survive weather and time without requiring either to be gentle. Caleb Holt, 1820-1891. He looked deeper. Owen took over the full management of the operation and ran it for the next 21 years with the same conservatism and the same hunger for improvement that had characterized everything the family had done on Black Ridge. He opened the new chamber within 6 months of his father's death, cutting the access passage to full standing height and installing hanging racks along the full length of the room's vaulted ceiling, which Whitfield's measurements had since confirmed was the most thermally stable environment yet found in the system. The temperature in that chamber held at 54 degrees without variation across all 4 seasons, and the products cured their long-cure hams that spent 8 weeks in the smoke at temperatures that never varied by more than 1 degree. Barrel-packed and shipped as far as New York, by the turn of the century acquired a reputation that the Louisville paper described in 1901 as beyond comparison. He trained apprentices who went out across Appalachia carrying the complete method in their hands, and he maintained his father's notebooks with additions in his own hand. New observations on curing times extended past the original ranges, experiments with wood combinations that Caleb had never tried. Measurements of airflow variation at different seasons recorded with the precision instruments Whitfield had left behind. The notebooks grew into a continuous document spanning 50 years of daily observation, a record of what this particular piece of the earth could do when someone paid attention to it. Daniel's book appeared in 1895, published by a Louisville printer in an edition of 500 copies that sold out before the end of the year and required a second printing before the following spring. It was a beautiful object, 280 pages of instruction and illustration, the technical diagrams precise enough to build from, and the geological sections accurate enough to teach from the prose moving between the register of a craftsman's manual and the register of a naturalist's journal with the ease of a writer who has grown up in a space where those two ways of seeing the world were never considered separate. The fold-out geological map of the Black Ridge Formation was cited in 3 university geology courses within the first decade of the book's circulation. 6 editions, over 40 years each, updated by a member of the family. Owen adding to the curing techniques section, Ruth's eldest daughter, adding a chapter on transportation and preservation for distant markets. Daniel himself revising the geological content after Whitfield's death to incorporate newer research. Food historians of the following century would cite it as a foundational text, a document that caught the transformation of American food preservation knowledge at the moment when the folk tradition of the frontier was meeting the systematic methods of modern agricultural science, and that preserved both in a form that honored their relationship rather than declaring one obsolete. Marta taught until the year she died. The school she had started in the back room of the timber frame building had grown by the turn of the century into a formal program operating under the name the Brower Holt School of Woodcraft, a name she had not chosen but had accepted because the students who named it had made a reasonable argument, and she was a woman who could be persuaded by reasonable arguments. 40 students a year, most of them women from the mountain communities who had the same background she had arrived with in 1854, practical skills and no formal instruction, in a determination to understand why things worked rather than simply that they worked. She charged nothing. She had always charged nothing. She believed that withholding knowledge was the most expensive thing you could do with it because the cost was paid not by the person withholding it, but by everyone who never received it. The furniture she built in her last years, still from Kentucky, cherry and black walnut, still seasoned in the cave's curing room, where the controlled humidity had been producing superior lumber for 40 years, still joined with the precision dovetail technique she had learned from her father's hands and practice and books, was sought after throughout the region with the particular intensity that attaches to work whose maker is known to be near the end of making it. She finished a set of 6 dining chairs in the spring of 1904 and set them on the broad porch of the timber building for a day to check their proportions in full light, and then brought them inside and sold them to a family in Lexington who had been asking for 2 years. She said nothing about them being the last set she would build. She didn't need to. She died in February of 1905, 78 years old, with the tools her father had brought from his Louisville workshop arranged on their pegs in the order he had taught her, and with the ledger she had been keeping since 1854, all current through the previous week's entries. Owen and Ruth and Daniel were with her. The cave was warm. It was always warm. The operation continued under Owen until 1912, when he passed the management to his eldest son, who ran it until the mid-1920s, and who passed it to his own son, the Ezra of the third generation, named for the great-grandfather he knew only from Daniel's book, in the notebooks, and the headstone in the limestone shelf above the cave entrance. This Ezra was a capable man who understood the technique he had inherited and applied it conscientiously. But the world he applied it in was not the world his great-grandfather had built it for. The middle decades of the 20th century arrived with refrigeration and the economics of industrial processing, and the arithmetic was simply the arithmetic. What one family in a cave could produce in 4 weeks, a processing plant in Cincinnati could produce in 4 days. The flavor was not equivalent. But flavor in the industrial age had been reclassified from a necessity into a preference, and preferences were the kind of thing you indulged when the margin allowed it. And the margin of the post-war middle class was occupied by other indulgences that were newer and louder. The last commercial smoking on Black Ridge took place in the fall of 1947, when the younger Ezra packed the final barrels and sent them to Louisville and wrote a letter to the distributor explaining that the operation was closing. The letter was 1 paragraph and contained no complaint. The cave maintained its temperature through all of it. 53 to 57 degrees year after year, decade after decade, the chimney effect continuing its slow, patient exchange between the deep passages and the ridge face above, regardless of what was happening in the chambers below. The firebox sat cold. The hanging rack stood empty. The flue channels were clear and would have carried smoke if smoke were offered. The draft moved through the main chamber at its accustomed 2 miles per hour, touching nothing now but air. Caleb's notebooks, all 11 of them, covering 40 years of daily temperature records, brine experiments, smoking schedules, wood comparison notes, and the geological observations that Whitfield had cited as primary data, were transferred to the University of Kentucky's Special Collections Library in the 1980s, where they were archived and cataloged and eventually digitized for researchers who would never have found them otherwise. Food historians, writing about the origins of American artisanal preservation, cited them the way scientists cite foundational papers, as the place where a systematic body of knowledge had been established for the first time in a particular field, the record of a man who had understood through daily practice what laboratories were only beginning to measure. The Black Ridge property remained in the Holt family through all the decades of the operation's decline and the subsequent silence of the cave. It was not sold, not because the family had any particular expectation of its future value, but because there was no compelling reason to sell it, and because some things accumulate a gravity of association that makes disposal feel like a different kind of loss than the loss you were trying to avoid. The cave was what it had always been. The mountain was what it had always been. The deed in the Holt family's possession was the same 40 acres the county surveyor had cross-hatched with embarrassment in 1831, and the headstone above the cave entrance was still there. The letters Daniel had cut into the limestone still deep and clean, still legible without effort. The great-great-granddaughter of Caleb Holt taught environmental science at a college in Lexington and drove to Harlan County every October, a drive of roughly 2 hours, depending on the traffic through the mountains, which she had made every autumn for 15 years without missing once. She was not a sentimental woman. Sentiment was not what brought her back. But she had grown up hearing the story and had come over the course of adult life to understand that some stories require the physical space in which they occurred in order to be fully comprehensible. The way certain mathematical proofs require the notation to be written out even when you have understood the logic. She made the walk up the switchback trail in the October morning, the stone arch at the third switchback, as solid as it had been in 1866 when Caleb had finished building it, the drainage ditches still doing their work a century and a half after his hands had placed the stones. She walked through the timber-framed building, which was maintained in reasonable repair by the family's minimal effort, and the mountain's indifference to entropy, and out onto the porch, where the valley was doing what it did every October, turning gold and copper and red. Below the ridge line, the mist in the hollows, the ridges above it, clear and silver in the morning air. Then she stepped to the cave entrance and stood there and felt the warmth come out. It was the same warmth, not a memory of warmth, not a representation or an echo. The actual physical molecular movement of air at 55 degrees flowing steadily outward from the mountain's interior, carrying the mineral smell of limestone and deep thyme and the faint ghost of hickory smoke that had penetrated the cave stones so completely over 40 years of continuous smoking that it had become part of the rock's chemistry, as permanent as any natural deposit. 140 years after Caleb Holt had pressed his hand against a gap in a rock wall on a September afternoon and felt this breath on his skin for the first time, it was still here, still moving, still warm. She stood at the entrance for a long time the way she always did, not thinking about anything in particular, not reviewing the history or performing the appropriate response, just standing in the warmth's path and letting it do what it had always done, which was simply to be what it was without asking anything in return. The earth gives what it gives. It does not negotiate, does not perform, does not require acknowledgement of what it offers. It holds its warmth in the dark interior of itself and exhales it steadily through the cracks. And if you happen to put your hand in the right place at the right moment, it will tell you something that cannot be said in any other way. Caleb Holt had known this, not because he was exceptional in his intelligence, though his intelligence was real, and not because he was exceptional in his courage, though courage in its quieter forms was something he possessed in abundance. He had known it because he was a man who asked questions and waited for the answers patiently enough to hear them, and because when the mountain offered him something, he had the sense to recognize it as an offer, and the character to accept it honestly, and the generosity to pass it forward. 40 acres of north-facing rock, a hole in the ground nobody wanted, 3 decades of daily attention to temperature and smoke, and the slow chemistry of salt and thyme. A family built in a carved room in the mountain's bones. A book that outlasted the building it was written about. A school that produced craftswomen who are still somewhere producing things made correctly with good wood in the right proportion. And the warmth still moving, still here, carrying the smell of old stone and all the long patience that preceded everything. She put her hand into the current of air at the cave entrance and held it there, the warmth moving across her palm, the way it had moved across his, the same temperature, the same steady breath, the same conversation the mountain had been having with anyone willing to stop and listen. Then she went inside.